Welcome to Humanity's Values, a podcast celebrating the exploration of relational living. My name is David Teachout, relational living mentor and therapist for Life Weavings LLC. For further information on this podcast, including recommended books for personal exploration and blog entries covering topics of psychology, spirituality, and human relationships, please visit lifeweavings.org. Thank you for joining me, and I hope you're as excited as I am to continue this journey of exploring our humanity. This podcast is an attempt at creating a relationship with you, one where sharing my reflections on humanity and spirituality begins a dialogue about how we live our lives. For many of us, myself included, we've struggled with defining our purpose, wrestled with ideas large and small, and in many different ways stumbled through that journey weighted down by the rigid structures of certain religions and other limiting ideologies. I, for one, was quite happy to leave fundamentalism behind, and after several years I realized I could remove the traps of other authoritarian systems as well. I could do this within a love of humanity and a desire to explore questions of meaning and purpose. I don't expect that we'll always be in agreement, but I do bring myself ready and willing to ask questions, explore ideas, and dive into what we value. Last episode we talked about identity, what it is, how we come about it, how we often utilize it to parse out pieces of reality to make, meaningful and coherent pictures that we call our experiences. And we explored a bit on how looking at this process can at times blind us to what's around us, what other possibilities are waiting to be discovered. When we only look at ourselves or another person through the narrow lens of a very small and singular label, it becomes easy to do what the theory of ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, discusses about fusion, the idea that a thought is irreparably and inevitably connected with a particular action. So there remains no freedom of expression, no freedom of change when we operate under the notion that once a person has a label, or even the ability for us to apply one, that therefore that encompasses all of who they are, then we have ceased looking at and contemplating the broader humanity of which we are both sharing, and instead limited them to a very, very small corner of their potential as individuals and their potential as fellow human beings. From that, it makes sense then to look at what is one of the most difficult of topics to look at in our own personal lives, and that is one of anger, one of resentment. The difficulty, of course, with this is that anger is, as far as I'm concerned, inevitable. Anger, like any other emotional evaluation, is an indication that you care about something. You don't ever get angry about the things you don't care about. So what anger is at least just at the bare bones ground level of the feeling itself, a indication of something we feel within, or something that at another level we've identified as being important to us has been violated. Our picture of what we believe should be the case has been thwarted. And we really don't need to go very far to see examples of this, not least of which undoubtedly in our own lives, but turn on any news channel, look up, any Facebook feed for that matter, and you'll find people getting angry and then expressing it because they have identified something they're upset about that has violated their sense of what should be the case, the idea of what reality should be. Unfortunately, anger is, in many ways, when we do not identify it from within the notion of a value being violated, and instead conflate it with our picture of the world, we lose sight of the fact that the basis for it is not the action that we perceive, per se, but our image of how a particular value should be acted upon. In some ways, it is not that we are initially angry over what is done. We are angry over the fact that what is done is a false representation of something that we care about, a value that we hold. This doesn't excuse the behavior, but it's an initial way of being able to look deeper and start addressing our way of engaging with the world and each other. Unfortunately, the common way of looking at anger, of conflating or fusing our emotional evaluation with particular behavior, is that it's self-reinforcing. We then act upon our evaluation, and every action we do reinforces the fact that we feel it is right about our picture of what is going on. And then, almost inevitably, because the way that we responded is often angering in and of itself for the other person, they then respond. And of course, their response is reinforcing the fact that their picture of what should be is, of course, right. And round we go in this never-ending and often increasing spiral of action-reaction and one-upmanship, as if the increase in volume, the increase in violence from word to deed to stronger deed, as if that escalation somehow means that each person cares more about the thing that they're looking at. And we have this notion that, well, if I scream louder, therefore I care more. In fact, then being quiet means that you don't care about anything. Both of which are not only false, but they're profoundly unhelpful. If instead what we have is the principle of, I will engage with you at a particular level that we can agree on until such time as that is no longer possible, and then we can take the next step, whatever that may be. If instead we begin with the notion of louder expression equates to legitimacy, then there really isn't any room for growing understanding. There isn't any room for finding out what we have in common, because we've already started with what we don't. We've started with behavior. And when we start with behavior, there is no common ground, because we're acting two or more different ways. If instead we start with, I am upset because something I care about, what I hold, a value that I possess, that I identify with, I am angry that such has been, in my perspective, violated. And that same process is occurring in the other person, then we can pause for a moment and begin to look at what is it that that person cares about. And I can virtually guarantee that what that person cares about, when you get down to the brass tacks, is something that you probably care about as well. Issues of personal autonomy, issues of financial responsibility, issues of family, issues of honesty, integrity. These are all things that everyone cares about. Our error is in making fused or inevitable connections between the thing we care about and a particular means of manifesting it. So then, looking at things that way of beginning with our shared humanity through the lens of value, through the lens of allows us to start working through our anger and resentment in healthier and more constructive ways. And with that in mind, I'll be going through a article from Psychology Today, the link of which can be found on the podcast page of lifeweavings.org under this episode, Working Through Anger Without Losing Your Head. And the article from Psychology Today is entitled 8 Strategies to Work Through Anger and Resentment. And we'll go through each one with, a little bit of commentary on each. So the first that the author goes through is practice identifying and allowing yourself to feel the underlying emotions that anger may be superimposed upon, such as hurt or fear. Strive to be present with and accept these feelings and the vulnerability they elicit. Number 2, practice being consciously present with your anger and resentment. Observe it. Allow it to simply be. Hold it. Visualize putting space around it. Notice what happens. Okay, to the first 2 because I believe they go well together. The idea here is essentially pause and reflect. And while that may sound really simple, it may sound like, well, okay, what's the point? How is this really going to help anything? The point is what I was talking about earlier, which is our tendency to fuse anger and resentment, which are evaluations, with particular actions. So if we pause and simply reflect on the fact that we are upset, if we halt the seemingly inevitable train between an emotional evaluation and an action, if we merely pause it, if only even for a moment, it allows us to begin seeing a broader picture of what is going on. It provides the space for reflecting on what is common, that this anger is not new, that this anger is not wrong, that it is a reflection of something within us, a sign, a directional sign to the fact that we still retain our humanity in the way that we care about things. And that's not a bad thing. That's not bad. Caring about things is simply never going to be a practice that I, or frankly anybody, should be dissuading you from. Noting that anger is just anger, not the particular actions, but noting that anger is inevitable brings us out of the idea that anger is in some way wrong, that anger is an aberration that needs to be removed, and instead into the space of, oh, this is part of what it means to be human. This is part of what it means to care. Far too often, people come in saying, I want my anger to be gone. Well, sorry, but that's not really the problem. Anger is not an issue. Anger is an evaluation. It's a recognition that you care about something. To remove anger is to remove the ability to evaluate. To remove anger is to remove the capacity for caring. When we really dig down, it's not anger that people want removed. It's the consequences of the actions that they do based on that anger. And so we come to point 3. Identify how you may have contributed to the situation that you are angry or resentful about. Be aware that people, including you, frequently play a part in the circumstances about which they are angry and or resentful. 4. Practice expressing anger and resentment differently. Share these feelings with safe, supportive individuals whom you trust. Journal or write about them. Discharge them through physical activity by working out, taking a walk or run, going for a hike, or playing a sport. If appropriate to the situation, participate in activities that promote social and economic justice and other forms of nonviolent activism. Okay, so 3 and 4. Now I understand if somebody immediately bristles at number 3 in particular. Like, what do you mean? How could I have contributed to this? I don't have anything to do with this. Clearly it's this other person. They have the problem. And it is precisely such language that makes it impossible to reflect on the broader reality of which we are all a part. It is precisely such judgment that makes very difficult our ability to see other ways of acting on our shared values. To identify how you may have contributed is not to abdicate the responsibility of the actions that another person did. Identifying contribution is simply to recognize that we live in a interrelational world. We live in a world in which all our actions operate out of a relational matrix. That none of us act in a context-less universe. None of us behave without any connection to anything or anyone else. The contribution may be small. It may be slight. But it's still there. And learning how to identify it provides substance to the process of broadening our vision of what it is to behave, of how we react to situations that are difficult. Because let's face it, the only way we're going to be able to, in number 4, practice anger and resentment differently is if we're able to see those other ways of acting differently. Who wants to journal and write when you're bound within the self-righteous judgment of I am right, therefore my anger and the way that I'm expressing it must therefore be true and the only way of doing it? Nobody wants to act differently when they believe that the way they're acting is not only right, but the only way of doing so. So we have to be able to start looking at our lives as operating within relationships of many variables, many contributions, if we are going to start acting differently. And we go to 5. Learn and practice relaxation and self-calming techniques, such as intentional breathing, mindfulness, meditation, yoga, qigong, progressive relaxation, and quiet, unplugged downtime. So here we have any number of, this is where techniques come into. One of the things that I like about teaching on emotional regulation and anger is I immediately remove the term management from my vocabulary. I am not interested in management. Management is to tacitly assume that the problem is the feeling itself. Nope, not interested in managing the feeling. Very much interested in looking how to express it differently. Nobody ever went to jail. Nobody ever lost a relationship merely for being upset. Those things, those consequences occur because of the way the anger was expressed. So I'm not interested in managing the anger. I am interested in broadening the space between that feeling and a particular action. And these relaxation self-calming techniques in particular mindfulness, progressive relaxation, intentional breathing. These are ways of doing it. They are ways of noting that we are never simply one thought or feeling, that the error is in thinking that we are. And we return, we'll go through 6 and 7 here. 6. As difficult as it may be, endeavor to practice treating people you feel angry at or have resentment toward with kindness and compassion. Notice what happens when you change how you act toward them. They will often change how they act toward you. And 7. Resist the urge to be a channel for the anger and resentment of others. The anger and resentment of others can be seductive. They can have an almost magnetic pull. Don't buy into it. Resist the urge to join in their negativity or participate in gossip. All right. This essentially is, both of these go right back into the idea of us living in a relational world. Nothing we do occurs in a vacuum. Nothing we do has no consequences. And those consequences can be as small as contributing to just a small degree the possibility of another person reacting in a particular way, to the large degree of violence, pain, suffering. Everything we do is like an ingredient in a soup. You put a little bit of salt into it, okay. The taste changes a little bit, but it's subtle. You put a lot of salt into it, and all of a sudden, you can't even swallow. It's gone from possibly delicious to disgusting. And there it is with how we act upon our evaluations, how we behave based on, or how we manifest our emotions. And yes, this is very difficult. It's why, I often will note that these practices should be done when you're actually feeling pretty good. Because the last thing that we want to do is attempt to change our behavior for the first time when we're already spitting fire. Because guess what? The odds are really stacked against you. And then when something doesn't happen, the change doesn't happen, and the consequences that you've become used to occur again, then you just dismiss the whole practice. Essentially, you just go, well, clearly this didn't work, so moving on. Well, of course it didn't work. You didn't learn to be angry in the way that you're doing. You didn't learn to manifest this from day one. You didn't learn to apply this behavior to more and more situations right from the start. This was learned. This is a way of applying the same behavior to one situation, then another, then another, then another. This is a habit that has been formed. And to replace that habit requires just as much patience, just as much dedication. In fact, it might even require more. But I can guarantee that if you don't try at all, then the cycle will just repeat and nothing new will happen. And lastly, number 8, practice applying the understanding that unless you've learned how to change the past, it's as good as it's ever going to get. Find ways to remind yourself of this whenever you need to. You don't have to like what's happening in the present or has happened in the past in order to accept it. And acceptance will free your attention and energy from the shackles of anger and resentment, enabling you to be more skillful in the present. Accepting that what has happened isn't going to change is not the same thing as ignoring the consequences. Accepting is to begin the process of looking at the past into the present and projecting into the future from outside of or from within a broader vision of what is possible. To accept is to not be trapped in a myopic or singular way of viewing a situation. And by doing so, it frees the attention, frees the energy from being constrained by that initial evaluation and its supposed inevitable behavior. so that we can explore new ways of acting, similar to those kind of seeing eye puzzles, where if you focus real hard, you can't see anything. It's just this mass of color. But if you kind of let go and kind of relax the eye and start seeing it from an edge, all of a sudden the image pops out. That's what we're talking about. Accepting what is in front of you is not the same thing as being okay with what you see. Accepting is about relaxing so that you can see what so far hasn't been seen. A new way of being. Okay, we are at the end here, and we'll engage in our own mindfulness. If you are able and it is safe to do so, please joining me in bringing the attention to the breath, closing the eyes, and bringing yourself into alignment with the air passing your lips, the lungs expanding as it collects what was around you. And then with the out breath, letting go. And with each breath, letting the thoughts that come up simply pass by. With each breath, relaxing into the moment of acceptance. Letting your shoulders come down, letting your breathing and heart rate settle. Of seeing as the thoughts and feelings come up and pass, that you are more than any of them. You are more than your anger. You are more than your love. You are more than your resentment. More than happiness. You are all of them. You are a whole human being seeking meaning and purpose, as is every other person around you. And we bring the attention again each time back to the breath, bringing it in and out, and relaxing into that moment. Okay, bring the attention back, open your eyes, feel the weight that has been removed. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Humanity's Values. I hope you are interested in continuing this exploration. And to help that out, please come on over to lifeweavings.org, where you'll find plenty of articles on the very thing we're talking about. Emotions, how we look at our world, how we look at relationships. Also, the podcast page there is full of links to other books and material that can help out exploring these issues, as well as a means of contacting me. If you have any questions or would like to share a story, I'd be happy to hear it. And if it's selected, the question or the story, for a future episode, I will let you know ahead of time. Regardless, I will respond to every email that is sent. Until next time, again, thank you for joining me, and I wish you well on the creation of that new habit and the exploration of what it is to be the best version of yourself.